It is July 31st, 2024. Big day in the state of Michigan. There was a Supreme Court decision that came out called Mothering Justice versus Attorney General. It dealt with two pieces of employment law, one with minimum wage and the second with paid sick leave. The question that the Supreme Court was asking or deciding on was whether or not it is constitutional for the legislature to adopt citizen-initiated legislation and amend it in the same term. They decided it is not constitutional. So what does this look like? Well, they decided that the law that was adopted in August of 2018 will be effective in 205 days. So that puts it out into February of 2025. And they also said that if there was a phase-in in that law, like there was for the minimum wage, that phase-in will also apply, and it will be adjusted for inflation. I want to read a couple of sentences from Justice Clement's dissent because I think it was spot on. I agree with her legal reasoning. I agreed with it back then in 2018. I agree with it now. She said, "There is certainly reason to be frustrated by the legislature's actions here, enacting laws proposed by initiative petition to avoid ballot approval only to substantially alter them in the same legislative session, but nothing in Article 2, Section 9 restricts the legislature from doing so, and as tempting as it might be to step into the breach, this court lacks the power to create restrictions out of whole cloth." This is what happens when you have an activist judge or activist court. They don't follow what the Constitution says to the actual text. I don't want to really get into that too much. Let's just look at the background of what happened and what it's going to look like going forward. So I did vote against adopting. I was serving in the House of Representatives at the time. I voted against adopting these two pieces of legislation. I'm going to read my comments that I said at that point in time, justifying my no vote. I said, today I voted no on adopting the minimum wage and paid sick leave ballot proposals. Both of these proposals will hurt Michigan workers and push businesses out of Michigan. Some argued that it was better to adopt the proposals because they are easier to amend once approved by the legislature. That argument may have some merit, but it is likely any changes made to the proposals this term could be tied up in the courts for years to come. I believe that eventually you have to stand for something and fight back. The liberal left is going to continue to pressure the legislature to adopt terrible policies if we continue to cave. Unfortunately, the worst case scenario I thought could happen has happened. So I think it would have been better to stand up and bring the case to the people of Michigan as to why these policies are bad and get them voted down on the ballot. Unfortunately, that's not the route that we went. So let's look at what was adopted in August of 2018. So in minimum wage, there was basically two big areas of change. The first was they established a $10 minimum wage in the year 2019, and it phased it up to $12 an hour by 2022, and then it was adjusted for inflation going forward. The second big thing it did was it made changes to tipped wages. So if anybody listening has worked in the restaurant industry before, they would know in the state of Michigan, you have to earn 38% of the minimum wage from your employer, and the remainder you earn on tips. If there was a situation where if you added those two pieces of income together and it didn't equal the state's minimum wage, your boss had to pay you the difference. So there was a safeguard that they earned at least the minimum wage, but it had two different components of income as to how you got there. So what that legislation did in 2019 is it phased it up. So the 38% went to 100%. So essentially, if you worked in a restaurant industry, you would have to earn a minimum wage. I think this part is the most sensitive out of all of the decisions here. There's an argument that small businesses are going to be really negatively hurt by the paid sick leave, but I do think just based on how hard restaurants have been hit over the last 4 years with COVID and with inflationary pressures and with increased labor costs, I think they're the most vulnerable, and I think the changes here puts our restaurant industry in the state of Michigan and the workers who work in the restaurants at great risk and great jeopardy. So what did the paid sick leave laws look like that were adopted in 2018? So essentially, it applied to all employers. If you had one employee, you had to offer paid sick leave. It was mandated. They had to be able to accrue 1 hour for every 30 hours that were worked. They would have to be able to have at least a minimum of 72 hours, and those hours had to be transferable year over year. There were two aspects of this law that were highly problematic. One was that it didn't address no call, no shows. So if somebody just didn't show up to work, essentially they would have to miss 3 days in a row before an employer could require any type of documentation. And if they did require documentation, they needed to pay any type of out-of-pocket costs. So this would have made it really difficult, especially if you owned a small business, to be able to make sure that your business was functioning and operating. The other big part of it was who was an eligible employee. Who did this impact? Well, the law said an eligible employee was any individual engaged in service to an employer in the business of the employer. So the way this reads, it could include part-time employees, it can include seasonal employees, and it could even be construed to include independent contractors. That's a huge problem because it's really unworkable, and it would be difficult to implement that going forward. So let's fast forward to December of that same term in 2018. The legislature amended this language to something new. So what did that new language look like? Well, for the minimum wage, it took the threshold from 2019, phased it in over 11 years to 2030, and it went from $9.45 an hour in 2019 to $12.05 an hour in 2030. It also got rid of the inflation adjustment, and it also, most critically, got rid of the changes to the tipped wage employees. So they would have remained at 38% of the minimum wage. Paid sick leave, a little more technical. I can't get into all of it in a short period of time, but the biggest changes were the number of employee thresholds. So for these mandates to be applicable to an employer, they had to have at least 50 employees. So if you're below that, wanted to make sure small business weren't going to, be crushed under this law. If you look at Obamacare, when that was put into place, same reason why they had a minimum number of employers, because they knew the mandates would be too hard for small businesses to weather. It also changed the number of hours, so it was you could accrue 1 hour for every 35 hours worked, and you could accrue up to 40 hours a year. Again, I'm not going to pretend like I explained all of the changes, but those are the most substantive. So what does this mean going forward in the state of Michigan? It's going to lead to negative opportunities, negative growth. It's not going to be good. You're going to see, if you look at the restaurant industry in California, that has implemented a high minimum wage for their fast food workers. It led to more automation, led to closures, led to employees having less hours worked, so less money overall. It's not compassionate to do this type of thing. It's a good talking point. It might seem like it's good, but when you really look at how this type of policy or these policies play out, it leads to less opportunity and less prosperity, which is not good for Michigan workers and Michigan employers. So what we need to do going forward, we have some time. This law is not going to take effect till next February. We need the Democrats, who are in majority right now, to come to the table, and we need to change these laws back to what they were before this decision takes effect. It's critical we do this because we need to make sure Michigan is a place where we can have growth, we can have opportunity, we can solve problems instead of create problems. So, I appreciate your time, and thank you, and God bless.